Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the main stage at DrupalCon on day 3. I'm very pleased to be bringing you this next session from Ben Morse, a developer advocate at Drupal. He's going to be talking about quantitative measures of user experience, the Web Vitals metrics that are used to help us judge the quality of web experiences. So without further ado, I'm going to let Ben take it away and tell us all about it.
Thanks, Tim. My name is indeed Ben Morse. I'm talking about Web Vitals and some new tools and new ways to measure web performance and make your users happier. I have to admit, despite what Tim just said, actually, there's an odd rhyme over here. I'm not actually a worker for Drupal. Actually, I work for a different company that almost rhymes called Google. I think they call it a slant rhyme. You know, Drupal and Drupal.
Thanks,
Drupal
Ben.
and Drupal would rhyme. But I feel like I'm at home. You know, it's like I'm already part of the family, so I appreciate that. You didn't say I worked for like WordPress or Joomla or Typo3 or something else. So I indeed do work at Google. I've actually made Drupal sites before, though, before I worked here. And my job is to help the web be faster and more beautiful and easier, kind of easier for developers to make fast, nice sites and easier for users to use the web in general. You may see behind me also in my attic here in this house in lovely New Jersey, a bunch of music stuff, which is because before Work from Home happened, this was my attic music studio. That's where I am pretty much all the time. Anyway, good to meet you. So your goal as a person who makes a website used on mobile phones is for people to see your site and just go, hey, this site is awesome. This content is great. This design is wonderful. This is useful for me. And also, look how fast that loaded. That was so pleasant. And a lot of studies have shown this. A lot of large companies have done various studies to show that when a site loads faster, people just like it better. It's just they trust it more. It's a better user experience. They just think, wow, that was quick. Somehow it's like your phone has to respond to you like part of your body. When your phone responds slowly, it's like you try to move your hand and say, okay, hand, move. And like then it moves. It's just not the same kind of hand. Your phone is like that. People want it to do things immediately, whether it's like you're using a messaging app or something else or playing a game. You press a button, something happens. When you press a button and say, go to this wonderful Drupal site, and then it kind of loads up slowly, and then things shift around on the screen as it loads, and then things pop in and pop out, you lose that experience of wonder you get from the web. Also, if you're using a really high-powered phone, like a nice iPhone or a Galaxy or a Pixel or whatever, on a nice 4G connection, then web speed isn't always as important. Studies show that it still matters, but it's not as crucial. But a lot of users use phones that are lower powered. Actually, a lot of phones that are being sold these days are not that high powered. And these phones will execute code more slowly and render the page more slowly, and they stress the browser out more. Even find that scrolling with animations and things like that involved may just look kind of funny. And people may be also having slower connections, especially if you're in a wealthy country in a nice city. If you're on a train or on a bus, you're traveling somewhere, it could drop out. I get that every day. I used to get that when I used to commute to New York from New Jersey. I had horrible connections for 30 minutes every day and no connection at all when I was in the tunnel. If you're in a rural area, you may have worse connections. If you're in a certain part of a building, and especially if you're in many countries in the world, connections often aren't that fast. 4G is common in many areas. In some areas, 3G is more common. And the last time I saw the numbers, it was that the average mobile page takes 12 seconds to load on a 3G connection. Now, this has improved somewhat when 3G speeds were lower and pages were a little bit heavier. It was 19 seconds a couple of years ago. 12 seconds is better. It's still kind of a long time, but it could be worse than that. Back when I used to travel places, I have T-Mobile, and T-Mobile gave me the gift of free Wi-Fi in every country, well, many countries in the world, but always on a 2G connection. And on a 2G connection, many sites didn't load at all, or took a minute sometimes. And you knew after a while which sites you could use, which sites you couldn't use. And in fact, last time I saw the numbers on this, in fact, 40% of mobile connections worldwide are 2G connections. So imagine loading a 2 megabyte heavy site on a 2G connection. It's not going to happen. So to make a site that everyone can use in different places, different situations, a site accessible to everybody, web performance is still pretty important. Otherwise, you get things like this, where this guy is here at this beautiful cafe table, trying to wait for your site to load. It's still not loading yet. And look at this. He's taken up smoking. and drinking to cope with the stress of watching this site load. So in order to prolong this person's lifespan, you must make your site faster. Okay, so there actually were some wonderful talks yesterday on web performance. There's a whole session on performance yesterday, or a whole, I forget what it was called. I watched a couple of these talks, wonderful talks about web performance. We know that it matters, but there's many ways to measure web performance. And what is it? Lots of things out there. There's the load event, there's DOM content loaded event, there's a speed index, first contentful paint. So how do we focus on metrics that seem to really be the most important metrics? Also, there's more than just speed that matters. There's other aspects. For example, if your site loads up and people are looking at your content and they press a button and nothing happens because JavaScript is still waiting to get executed, or a long task is happening that's blocking the browser from even sending you the event in the first place. If your site isn't responsive, it's also not a good user experience. And furthermore, if you're looking at a page, I get this a lot these days with recipe sites. You're looking at a page, you load up some content, and then suddenly an ad pops in somewhere, or an image pops in, or even worse, ad with a video pops in, things all move around all of a sudden. Content can move down or move to the side to make room for that new content. And the shifting can happen sometimes 4 or 5 times during a page load. That kind of bouncing around of content is also not a good user experience. And our speed metrics don't really capture that. We know that it's not good, but it's hard to capture that with speed. In fact, you can't. So what do we do? Well, a lot of folks spent the last couple of years talking about this, as people do. People at the W3C Web Performance Working Group, people at Google, other companies discussed these things for a long time and came up with some metrics that they liked, which are called Web Vitals. Web Vitals, there you go. And this is 3 metrics that people have aligned around that are good metrics to measure whether your site is healthy and performant. Now, of course, these may change with time. They're iterative, but this is the first version of these. Notice this is from the Chromium blog. And we're saying here in the Chromium blog that Google wants to have unified guidance. So our attempt at Google is to all discuss the same things, which doesn't always occur at a large company. You may have noticed before if you follow things at companies like Google. But in this case, we've got our ducks in a row. Thank you very much. Because also right around the same time, there's an announcement here on the Google Webmaster blog over here. And they made a very interesting announcement. They said that soon these Core Web Vitals would be used as a ranking signal in Google search. So you probably already are aware that that page speed is a ranking signal in Google search, especially in mobile. Well, that will soon be changing to Core Web Vitals instead. Not changing immediately because they want to give folks time to adjust to the idea. And plus, due to COVID-19, people are working from home. You can't make big changes now on your site that easily. So at some point in the near future, perhaps early next year, perhaps some other time, this will happen. It'll be a new ranking signal. And I'll have various links here during this talk. There's a long link there on the bottom. I think I have more short links in general later on. So this happened. Also notice in that box over there, the thing about the top stories carousel. If you use google.com, you may have seen, on the wrong tab, here we go, this top stories carousel. All of these things here are AMP pages. They're pages that use AMP, a technology which is open source, started by Google, mostly still developed by Google, but it is an open source project that's now under the family of the OpenJS administration. So OpenJS runs, it's a part of the OpenJS family, basically. These pages here are AMP, and AMP is a web components library that makes it simple to make fast sites and has a lot of restrictions, so you can't make slow sites quite as easily. Everything in this top stories carousel over here is an AMP page. Well, this will be changing now. So in the future, the near future, this badge may change. And instead of this being just AMP pages, it'll be any pages that meet Web Vitals criteria. To repeat that, these top stories will be replaced by things that meet Web Vitals criteria. Now, AMP pages are still a pretty easy way to get to these criteria because AMP pages tend to be fast and not shift around that much because they're not allowed to be that slow without a lot of difficulty. But this is going to be a big change. So there's various reasons why Web Vitals are important to try to learn about. Of course, the most important thing really is make your page better for your users. I mean, I think it's secondary, whatever Google does in search. The most important thing is a good user experience. But Web Vitals are hopefully a good proxy for good user experience in terms of speed and stability and interaction. So given that wonderful preamble there, what are Web Vitals? Good question. So the idea is to meet these three criteria I was talking about before. Number one, loading speed. The user's looking at your screen there. Are things happening? Is it loaded? Is it not there yet? Page load. Number two, interactivity. Does the page respond to user actions? And number three, visual stability. What I was discussing before, as the page loads up, do things shift around a lot? Or is it just like it appears and there it is, things don't shift around? The core web vitals are designed to meet these three needs. On the left over here, the first one, largest contentful paint. In the middle there, first input delay for interactivity. And on the right, cumulative layout shift for stability. Notice that these are measured in different kinds of ways. Largest contentful paint, we think that good is 2.5 seconds or less before that appears. And then between that and 4 seconds is pretty good. Above 4 seconds, you should try to improve it. First input delay, we think, should be less than 100 milliseconds. And cumulative layout shift is a scoring, which we'll be discussing in a little bit. So these are the things you want to be able to meet. And the goal that has been set is that 75% of user interactions meet these criteria. Now, I said user interactions. These actually are being measured from real data in the real world. It isn't on some server somewhere sitting around at Google or somewhere else. This is from the Chrome User Experience Report. Here's an article on that from Search Engine Land. You may have noticed if you use PageSpeed Insights to measure your performance that a couple of years ago, they added in something called field data as well as lab data. So in the past, it measured performance based on, there were some servers somewhere and you ran the site on some browsers and measured what happened under certain simulated conditions, certain speeds, certain kinds of phone speeds, certain network speeds, and so on. What now is happening is that it's using something called the Chrome User Experience Report, which is anonymized data from many, many Chrome users out there. This actually is how real users are using your page. And this data is accessible to everybody. You can go into BigQuery and query this data and check out your site or any site and see how fast it is, how stable it is, and so on. So let's go into these metrics in some more detail now. The first one, largest contentful paint. Again, there are metrics like DOM content loaded and load events, things like that. There was first contentful paint, which is useful, but a loading indicator can kind of trick that. First meaningful paint is a good one. Speed index is a favorite of mine for a long time. Speed index web page test used to determine kind of how much of the stuff above the fold was appearing. But it turns out the largest contentful paint is pretty easy to measure and a pretty good proxy for page load. And very easy to explain. Speed index required using some calculus to explain. This simply is when the biggest thing above the fold appears. That's LCP. The biggest thing might have been an image. It could have been a video. It could have been a block of text, a background image, the biggest thing that appeared when that appeared above the fold. By above the fold, I mean, if you're looking at a device, the stuff that you see before you scroll down. So it's kind of intuitive. You're looking at a page over here, and the biggest thing that's going to appear appears. There it is, largest contentful paint. That's number one. So to see more about this, I have a lot of links in this presentation. To see more details, there's a lot more at web.dev/LCP. And then FID, the next one we have over here, first input delay. Also simple to explain. It's simply between the time when the page actually is first interacted with until the browser can respond to it. So once the page is painted and things appear and things are on there and the user does something, how long does it take for the user to actually be able to do something and get a response from that? Often this is between the first contentful paint and time to interactive. But we think that a delay of more than 1/10 of a second is not that great. You want to have the user go there, see a menu button, press the menu button, and something happens. For more information on this, go to web.dev/FID. And then CLS, cumulative layout shift, actually a little more complicated to explain, but simple to show. Again, the example there in front of you, there's a button there that's appearing. When the button appears, everything just kind of shifts on down. That's a bad user experience. This is measured by simply taking the sum of all layout shifts that occur as the page is being painted and adding those things together. And each of those is measured as followed. It's impact fraction times distance fraction. Impact fraction is how much of the page moves. Distance is how far it moves, measured as percentage of the actual viewport itself. So if it moves, if you have 400 pixels high and 400 pixels wide moving, then with 200 pixels, multiply those percentages together, and there it is. So again, it's the percentage of stuff that moves times how far it moves. And the sum of all those things together is called cumulative layout shift. Many sites have a good score on this, some of them don't. What Reaver? This is repeating things here. LTP, FID, I'm confused. I think I pressed the wrong button. Going on a little bit here, all these things again are from real user measurements, sometimes called RUM to be cute. This is all based on Chrome user experience data. You also can measure these things on your computer, which you call lab data. And there's various ways to measure these things. Again, there's 3 website URLs there to have more information: web.dev/FID/LCP and /CLS. You can use the event timing API to determine FID. And you see the rest of it. I won't read all the things that's on the slide, but there they are. To find more about these things, there's more information on web.dev. The 2 links at the bottom tell you how these were chosen and how we chose the thresholds, the numbers that you saw, and why 75% of people was useful. If you have questions also, or you have comments, please put those things in the chat, because I may look at those. If I notice over there what things in the chat, I'll try to say hello and answer questions or take those things. So it turns out these things are useful. There was a test that was done. They looked at lots of different page impressions and found that a site that meets these criteria, the user is 24% less likely to abandon page loads before the first content is painted. So as sites met these thresholds better, people stayed on your site more. And of course, if they're on your site more, they'll stay there for longer, view your content. If you're selling things, they could buy more things. The key is that the funnel of users is bigger from the beginning. So if you have goals for the users on your site, all those goals get met more often if they don't just leave your site because they're sitting there looking at their phone and things are not loading. So then, of course, the question is, how about Drupal? How do Drupal sites do on these things? Here's a measurement from a bunch of Drupal sites out there on the web. You can see we tested lots of different sites out there that are Drupal sites, because this data is all available in the Chrome User Experience Report. You can do this yourself too. And you see that each metric is actually not too bad. LCP, CLS, FID are all met in most cases. But of course, meeting all 3 of those cases is harder, because if you meet, say, a large contentful paint in 3/4 of cases, and everything else is 3/4 of cases, then to meet all 3 is 3/4 to the 3rd power, which is 27/64, which is less than half. So you see that a bit less than half of pages, they're just desktop pages, pass all 3, and less than 1/4 on mobile. Notice the difference over here, especially in first input delay. On desktop pages, rarely ever a problem with Drupal sites. Drupal sites excel at low first input delay. On mobile, it's harder. And of course, the reasons for that: mobile sites tend to be on worse connections, and mobile phones tend to execute JavaScript more slowly than desktop devices do. So Drupal sites do pretty well, actually, but could do better. So how do we actually make that better? By, of course, measuring it first. How do you measure Web Vital scores and know what they are so you can improve them? There are many ways to do this. And once again, we have all of our ducks in a row, because there's various tools that Google offers that do this. And most of these do it. PageSpeed Insights, which is a popular tool for measuring these things. The Chrome User Experience Report we've been discussing. Google's Search Console, Chrome and Chrome DevTools, Lighthouse, and Web Vitals extension are all ways to do this. Of course, there are more, but these are 6 of the ways you can use to measure these things. Now, it turns out that, again, these things are measured by Google with this field data from the Chrome User Experience Report. You can't get those things in DevTools because you're on your own computer. Lighthouse also runs on your own computer in general. So what you can get instead is total blocking time, which is how long JavaScript blocks things from running, which is a pretty good proxy for FID. If TBT isn't good, FID will probably be suffering as well. So you really can get all these metrics more or less from 6 different tools. Number 1, PageSpeed Insights. This is a tool that you may have seen before. You go to this PageSpeed Insights page over here, you put in a URL, and it gives you data on this URL. It used to, again, go to Google servers, run some tests, and give you the results. Now it does that still, but it combines this with results from the Chrome User Experience Report. So you get a combination of this lab data from running it on Google servers right now and the field data from actual users. It gives you a score from 0 to 100, which often is talked about, but I kind of would ignore that score unless it's really, really bad or really, really good. and consider more the kind of web vital scores over here. How are these scores doing on PageSpeed Insights? And also look at the advice it gives you on how to fix things. This is from a site I looked at yesterday. I won't say what it is because it didn't do very well, but there's a lot of things over here. Yes, you can't test your site as talk is going on. This is hard. Making performance good is a challenge. So we'll be discussing some ways to improve your performance at the end of this talk. It's just hard because you can make a site faster, and then you add some modules to your page, add some more images that are large images by mistake, and it gets slow again. It takes some work. There also are some shortcuts we can discuss at the end of this talk as well. So yes, you'll find recommendations here on ways to improve your site. For example, looking at the top there, removing unused JavaScript. Of course, the JavaScript is there and it isn't being used, loading its waste of time. Looking down there a little further, multiple page redirects. Of course, each page redirect involves a network request, which can slow things down. Third-party code is a common problem at the bottom there of the page. Trackers, pixels, all those kinds of things you add to your page for business reasons that sometimes load before visible content does. So there's that. Number 2, the Chrome User Experience Report. This is a little more for developers to use. Again, this is based on real Chrome users around the world and data from them. You can use Google BigQuery to run queries over here. You can visualize it in Data Studio. There's also an API. To try this yourself, go to bit.ly/crux-tool, and there you go. In fact, I did this myself yesterday. It was pretty easy to make something here. Oh, sorry, this is not that. Is this that? No, this is not that. This is mine. Okay, there at the top, there's a little Chrome User Experience Dashboard of Ben. So I just ran this thing really quickly on google.com, which is a site that's on the internet somewhere, and saw that google.com had good LCPs. The FID was good on desktop. On phone, FID was a little bit slow. So interesting feedback for the Google team. Maybe watch the first input delay. Pretty easy to use. Number 3, if you use Google Search Console, they're now integrated there too. So if you care about this for search reasons in Google for your search ranking, you can get a report right there in Search Console. And there it is from the Chrome User Experience Report. Again, you can see this site over here had a lot of good results, some that needed improvement, and some that were considered to be poor. So if you use Search Console, you can do it there too. Something else, my favorite tool of all, is Chrome DevTools. This is an easy way to look at your site and to see what's going on. So simply go to the network panel over there. I like to throttle to a fast 3G connection, that kind of thing, and just see what loads, when it loads, and see it seems like it's extraneous or big. This is not a DevTools talk over here. I can't do a demo for you right now because we don't have time, but you've used this before probably. If you use Firefox or other browsers, they have tools like this as well, especially Edge does these days. It's very similar now to Chrome DevTools because Edge now uses Chromium. You'll find big JavaScript files sometimes that load up before visible content. You'll find big images pretty frequently. Just go through here, find big files that load up before things happen, and see if you need those files or not. If certain modules add those files, see if you can dump those modules or use different modules that have less JavaScript, or at least have them enqueue those things on fewer pages, or enqueue those things not in the head, but somewhere else on the page. Something else you can get from DevTools over here is this Performance tab, which has been around for a little while. It will show you the film strip, which used to be somewhere else. You can now see actually a little snapshots of how your site's loading and where it is at various points. So 2 seconds in, are things visible? 4 seconds in, what's been painted yet? 10 seconds in, what's been painted yet? Those kinds of things. It also now gives you cumulative layout shifts. You can see there in red, those things saying layout shift under the experience area. It will now find when there is layout shifting as the page loads and mark those things for you and tell you even where things have moved to and give you a score. So again, you can use this tool now to get cumulative layout shift as well as information about how long the page takes to load and first input delay. What else do we have here? Number 5, Lighthouse. This is a tool that you can use to, again, measure all of these metrics. Lighthouse's API is also used by PageSpeed Insights. It's the same API now, so you see the same information in both of these things, plus more information also in PageSpeed Insights. If you want to see more about Lighthouse, go to web.dev/performance scoring. It discusses how these scores get calculated over here. Lighthouse you can use right there in DevTools. Is one of the tabs now in DevTools by Elements and Console. There's Lighthouse. You can also use it as a command line tool or in a node module. which means you can actually use that in, oh, hold on, the wrong slide. You can use it also in continuous integration. You can just have Lighthouse API be part of your before you commit code, run a test, see how it's doing. Also, a new thing in Lighthouse is called Lighthouse Stack Packs. They are adding in these things that are specific recommendations for certain CMSs. There's now a Drupal set of recommendations. So it will give you recommendations that include this Drupal-specific language, like, okay, I want to do this thing over here. What modules will actually do it? I'll get recommendations here from this. This is not Lighthouse yet. This is a recent commit. I'm told it should be occurring in Lighthouse 6.3, which should be launching relatively soon. It has to then appear in Chrome if you're using it in Chrome. So it'll be in Chrome at some point in the near future. It's not there yet, but it will get there soon. Also, number 6, my last way of measuring these things, Web Vitals extension. This is a Chrome extension you can get. If you want to get this for Chrome, if you use Chrome, go to bit.ly/Web Vitals extension. And this just gives you all these measurements right there in a Chrome extension. Pretty handy. Any site you go to the site, then pop in there and see the scores. This uses a JavaScript library you can also use called Web Vitals. It's here on GitHub. It's open source. And you can also use that if you'd like to. In fact, let's just wrap it around that library. And also, in fact, you can do this yourself. If you just incorporate Web Vitals into your project, you can then import, get CLS, get FID, get LCP, whatever you want to, and go ahead and measure and log these things. It's pretty easy to do. Also, saying before continuous integration, there's a whole package for that as well. Lighthouse-CI allows you to integrate Lighthouse into your CI workflow. So if you actually have a regression of some sort, if somebody in your team adds a 1 megabyte image to your site, you'll notice it by this integration tool. Finally, a tool I made myself, which could be useful for you still. This is like a non-programmer tool, but I found it to be pretty handy. This is called Speed Daemon. I made this a couple of years ago, and people use it to run web page test results automatically. It actually calls Web Page Test API, and it gives you every week or interval that you specify. It gives results here on your site. So if someone adds a large image or something else happens, you'll see a sudden change over here. It also will alert you by email if it exceeds thresholds you've set yourself. This uses web page tests. I should actually change this to use Lighthouse API, shouldn't I? You also could fork the code if you want to make your own version using Lighthouse. Anyway, this is just a tool that can be used by non-programmers. You can give it to your marketers. They just have a spreadsheet. It runs automatically every week, and they know whether things have gotten slow or not. Okay, so that was ways to measure it. A lot of things over there. And now, of course, how do we improve things? Well, improving things is good. So let's see, here we are. The thing is with CMSs that you tend to use a lot of modules to make your website happen. So these modules may add their own JavaScript and CSS, and they may add these things every page in your site, whether things are used there or not. I've seen examples, for example, where a reCAPTCHA JavaScript library is loaded on every page, while it's only used on somewhere like on a checkout page. So it can be hard with the CMS because modules just do things and you don't always know what they're doing. One advantage, though, of Drupal is I don't see a lot of large JavaScript bundles from React or Angular or libraries like that. So I see less of those things, but as with all CMSs, you tend to see sites with a lot of JavaScript and CSS, maybe more than they need. So too many modules can be a problem, but also this tools here are supposed to indicate lots of different tools using to build your site, maybe too many tools, but also some tools you can use to improve your site. So for example, what causes poor largest contentful paint? Things like server response times, things like render blocking JavaScript and CSS, resources that are slow to load. I guess client-side rendering isn't really a problem as much for Drupal, but the other ones can be a problem. We're not going to discuss server response times over here. It's kind of out of scope for our front-end talk, but render blocking JavaScript and CSS, you can make this better by having less JavaScript, less CSS, looking at your modules, seeing which ones load a lot of JavaScript and CSS, considering using something else, or making sure they enqueue their JavaScript so it loads later on, or using async and defer so things aren't loaded immediately, so the browser can choose when to load things. We can discuss more about also this one over here, slow resource load times. Things like images are still a big problem on the web. People often just will load up large images on their site, not realize they're so big, and then they forget to make them smaller ever. I've done it before, even recently. We've all been there. So of course, the solution is make the images smaller. Okay, How do you make them smaller? Well, of course, if they're really big, choose smaller sizes or compress them. Until the image optimized module is a good way to do this. Also, for something to run in your browser, Squoosh.app is a wonderful way to look at your image and try different kinds of compression, make sure it still looks good, make them much smaller. I've often found that a large image can be as small as like 30K, 40K after using Squoosh.app. Uses WebAssembly to do this stuff all in the browser. It's quite nice. It's also important to use responsive images. I guess the responsive image module is a good way to do this. Responsive images means, of course, you're not loading larger images on smaller devices that won't use those things. You want to have a smaller image for a smaller device. And for larger devices, larger images, try to use source set, try to use tools like that to make sure that only the image that's appropriate for the device gets loaded. And also, lazy loading is a good way to do this, because if things are being loaded somewhere, if things are being loaded early, that are images or whatever that are somewhere down on the screen, then those things can block things that already are visible when you're just first loading a site. So you're looking at your site over there, things aren't appearing because it's loading things that are down somewhere off screen. So try modules like lazy load and Blazy for this. Also, now HTML does support lazy loading in images natively. So you should do this. It makes things faster, makes things better. For JavaScript and CSS, for large JavaScript CSS files, of course, less of them is better. Make them smaller. Do compress, do minify. Don't use modules on all pages if modules only are applied to certain pages. As I was saying before, load things later. Use async and use defer to load things later. But really, compressing is very basic. Minifying is very basic. Using gzip on your server is very basic. Set those things up. It makes things better. I saw also this still is possible in Drupal. You can simply concatenate CSS files and JS files together, which is quite useful. You can also use the advanced CSS JS aggregation module for this purpose. This means you have just as much CSS and JavaScript, but you have fewer files being loaded because they're all squashed into fewer files. Now, if you use HTTP2, this is not worth doing because HTTP2 does many requests in parallel. The HTTP 1.1, you should be taking your files and combining them together so that you have fewer files on every page. So there's that. Number two, what causes poor first input delay? Well, it's mostly about JavaScript. So if there's JavaScript that's running for a long time, it can block the browser from doing other things. The browser is single-threaded, JavaScript is single-threaded. So if something's happening in JavaScript and an event happens, the browser has to wait until your JavaScript finishes to give you the event, run the event handler. That can slow things down. Also, of course, long tasks. If you have complicated JavaScript from a complicated framework, it takes a while to execute, that will slow things down as well. So you want to avoid all this excessive JavaScript, which takes a long time to respond to user input. Finally, poor content layout shift, CLS. There's ways to make that better. Well, there's a bunch of things you should be doing. You know, web fonts can suddenly get bigger and make things shift around, especially on the third thing over there. It's a problem. You inject an ad or something else in the middle of a page and things shift around. Those things are a problem. But looking at things on the left, these are probably kind of easier to solve. The problem is that when things have no dimensions declared in advance, the browser can't tell how big they're going to be. So if there's no dimensions, the browser sticks them in there and things may move around to make room for your new image or your ad or embed or iframe. So how do we solve that? Back in the olden days, the best practice was to simply give dimensions in advance, because if you give the browser the dimensions, it can reserve space for your image and you're all set with that. Let me grab some water real fast over here. This is an old best practice, specifying dimensions right there in the HTML. But it's harder now because you have responsive design. You might just be saying width is 100% or max width 100%, and then sizing it to the container. In that case, the browser doesn't know how big the image is going to be at all, and the browser can't really size things appropriately. The new best practice is to specify the width and height as an aspect ratio. So this could be actually the wrong width and height, but the ratio is correct. And then the browser knows the ratio. Once it gets the height or the width, it can calculate the other one as well. So once it knows the container size, it can then calculate everything, and it lets the browser still go ahead and leave space for things in advance as you could before. So for images, do specify dimensions as an aspect ratio, even if they're wrong for certain devices. If the ratio is always correct, then you will be all set. And then, of course, for different devices, specify different widths, different image sizes using source set. Also, you can use AMP. AMP does all these things here for you. AMP is the open source project that Google started that is a web components library I mentioned before. If you haven't used it before, it does things like it requires you to use dimensions in all your images and other objects. So your content layout shift is very slow. And also, if you use valid AMP, it restricts you from using much JavaScript. So JavaScript tends to be lower. It does a lot of things to make the page faster, to make animations smooth, and tries to make all of these Web Vitals scores good out of the box. That's what it was designed to do. So I recommend trying AMP. The thing is that there's not like a lot. There's an AMP module for Drupal. It doesn't do as many things as, for example, the WordPress module does. The WordPress, I guess they call it a plugin. The WordPress plugin does a lot of stuff to help you reduce your CSS and convert images to AMP images, convert YouTube videos to AMP YouTube videos, and so on and so forth. It guides you through the whole process. That doesn't only exist for Drupal, but there's some progress in this area. The team that makes the WordPress plugin for AMP is now trying to extract the post-processor logic into something you can use for any CMS. So all the stuff they use to process style sheets, to do tree shaking, to convert things to the AMP HTML, those are being extracted into their own PHP library, which any PHP-based CMS could then, in theory, use. If you're curious about this project, then check out this issue here on amp-project/amp-wp. We're almost done over here. I think we actually are basically done. So Web Vitals, try them out. Again, there are things that Google will be using as a ranking signal in search, but that isn't really as important as a good user experience. What matters most is that your user gets to your site, your beautiful site loads quickly, and things happen quickly. And for more information, go to web.dev/vitals. And I'm Ben Morse. That's me on Twitter. And I'll be around today, so please say hello at some point during the conference. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Ben, for your presentation. I have seen a couple questions come through, and I may have one or two of my own as well, actually.
Okay.
But let's see here. The most simple question is, will you be able to make these slides available later if people want to reference this information?
Yeah, there's a lot of links and things on these slides. I think I said like 10 million words in 37 minutes. So yes, I can share this if there's some way to share it with people. I don't know how, but let me know how, and I will make it available.
Sure, yeah. If you send it to me after this, I'll attach it to the session note on Drupal.org. So
yeah,
I'll make sure that's available to people. Chris Green makes a comment that I think actually becomes an interesting question, which is, does anyone else find lazy load content to be annoying about mainstream sites, making it hard to use browser search or use keyboard navigation as an accessibility concern, perhaps, or have content pop in? I think maybe there's a misconception, though, between what's happening during lazy load and some of the other things that can happen in terms of content shift. So would you like to talk about that a little bit more and how that affects user experience?
I want to grasp the question a little better, but my impression is there are sites out there that say things like, here's an amazing article, click here to read more, and then you click there and then more things appear. Those kinds of things occur sometimes. Lazy loading, if done right, simply means that things that are lower down on the screen will appear before you get there, or as you get there, but not long before you get there. So this is a really good example. If you have a YouTube video, for example, towards the bottom of a page, YouTube's JavaScript is pretty large, and so is our CSS. Then to have those things loading immediately as you're looking at content loading on the top is kind of silly. It's better as you scroll down, your page detects, oh, we'll be there in about one screen or so. They'll start loading the YouTube videos soon. If that was the question, which I hope it was.
Thanks, Chris. I'm glad I got it mostly right. If you have a follow-up, please feel free to add that as well. The other comment in here was just about the loading equals lazy attribute, and John was mentioning maybe it's only supported in Chrome. My understanding is it's actually pretty widely supported now, except for maybe one or two mobile browsers that aren't quite there yet. Is that something you have the data on or can comment on?
I've been following this, but not in the last couple of months. I'm not sure what the latest is on that. I know Chrome did it. Other browsers were doing it. People want to do it because it seems like a thing which is useful universally. So I'm not sure where you're looking at right now. You can go to Can I Use? Yeah. You can see where it is.
I'll post a link for you. There's actually a Drupal.org core issue for making the loading equals lazy attribute a default in Drupal's core image handling API, in the WYSIWYG, and in the Twig templating engine. And in that issue, I think I have a link to the Can I Use page that has the browser support. And the nice thing about that attribute is that even if that attribute's not supported, the fallback is clean in basically any browser. So.
What to kind of use here? I'm seeing Chrome, yes. Firefox, yes. Edge now uses a Chromium, so yes. Opera, yes. IE isn't under development anymore. Safari doesn't have it, although there's an experimental features in Safari, so maybe it's coming to Safari soon. And it's not there on Opera Mini or Opera Mobile.
Okay.
It's getting there.
Yeah, I think it's coming along, and that's one of those features, particularly the loading attribute seems like such a no-brainer that hopefully we'll bring it into Drupal and other places soon. On that note, actually, Ben, are you aware, there's a lot of work that Google does in general to try and find creative solutions or to try and introduce new web standards and promote their adoption, like things like the loading attribute for performance in general. Do you feel like that continues to be sort of part of the strategy, is like see what new standards can be developed? I know there's a mix between, how long it takes to get a standard done and the need to move quickly, but I'm curious to hear a little bit of the inside baseball.
Yeah, that is the effort as far as I can tell. People are always talking to people out in other places and trying to get web standards to move along, but they are slow, as you know, and they're slow often for good reasons. Often they involve a lot of different people, different walks of life, and different browsers and so on. You see Google trying to make web standards to improve performance, working on other projects to improve performance, and also just going their own way sometimes, like AMP, for example, was a way of using current web technologies to make sites that were faster and using a cache to make things faster. So I think both those things are being done. It's weird because the web is so wonderful and so diverse and so useful, and people have been talking about performance now for the last 10 or 15 years. And page sizes, page loads haven't really gone down for a long time. I think they began to improve kind of recently, but for years it was just more and more stuff, larger images, more JavaScript. And that's actually, I think, begun to turn around some, but it took a long time.
I feel like the trend was, as soon as your internet connections got better, the pages got heavier and the experience just wound up washing out to the same slow times instead of really making traction on actually improving, which
it's like software. As you get more powerful computers, you get more complicated software and layers of abstraction. So things get slower all over again.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, one last question for you, which has to do with what you said just up at the front at the beginning of the presentation about the Google Site Carousel, how that currently displays AMP pages, but is also being updated to display any other site that meets the same performance standards, if I understand that correctly, right?
That was a good way of putting it, yeah.
Yeah, so if those sites, are those standards specifically published yet? I know that's still an active process, maybe not ready yet. In terms of these Web Vital metrics, like, do we know if you meet this first contentful paint and this meaningful shift and all those things, that's the bar that you clear? Or is that information that's maybe coming soon?
I would turn back to the official word on this because this is all official search stuff, and search tends to get very officially. So I'm going to go back to the slide over here where I had the link, if I can find it. Here we go. There, the webmaster blog over there. This is the information that's public over here. Core Web Vitals will be used. What will it be exactly? That's not clear to me. And how big will the signal actually be? It's always going to be kind of private because it's just Google search never reveals how important something is. I can tell you that AMP pages do not all meet these standards either. So it'll be a matter of just simply pages that meet these standards will get this kind of privilege, and pages that don't won't get it anymore either. It's the final decoupling of the AMP from Google thing. AMP is now an OpenJS project. Again, those who work on it mostly are Google engineers, but really it'd be a matter of how good the experience is. Make it good however you want to. AMP is a pretty good way to make experiences that are good, but there are restrictions with AMP, so you have to choose how to do it.
And I know
the goal is just having better user experiences.
Exactly. And I know that folks may have questions further about performance, and you mentioned earlier that you'll be hanging around the conference if people want to try and message you. The other thing for folks who are here in the longer term, David Strauss, who's a Drupal community member and member of the security team for Drupal, is also, I believe, part of an advisory board for AMP or something like that for that project. So he happens to be another person in the Drupal community that you might talk about if you're curious about that and how it's become decoupled from a central Drupal technology to its own open source effort. But with that, I'd just like to say thank you to Ben for this presentation on performance. I will get back with the slides attached to the schedule node once we get back around to it. But again, thank you very much for the presentation and for the education on this material. And we really appreciate that you could join us.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
All
Looking forward
right,
to
thanks
meeting
a
you
lot.
all.
Bye-bye for now.